It's been a year dominated by the continuing COVID-19 crisis, and South Africa was also further battered at an economic level by the July civil unrest in KZN and parts of Gauteng. Now, small businesses are hoping for better fortunes in 2022. Let's talk about this disconnect and what's needed in order to create a conducive environment for growth and also to bring down the country's record high unemployment rate, which currently is hovering very close to 35%, and that is just the official statistics. We're joined by Growth Point Properties Executive for Corporate Social Responsibility, Shawn Theunissen, who's written about this issue. Shawn, a very good evening to you. Happy New Year. So you've written about what you say is a disconnect between government's message that we need SMEs to grow the economy and government then delivering or creating an environment where the SMEs are even able to grow or just exist. Why does that disconnect exist?
Good evening, Thembekile, and good evening to the listeners as well. I think the biggest challenge that we find is that, government's role, in my opinion, is to create an enabling environment. And if we reflect on 2021, which was a year where SMEs were to go through another year of COVID lockdowns, we had unrest, and we just did not see government policy coming to the party in order to create an enabling environment. So even though you have, in terms of the National Development Plan, a focus on small and growing businesses, we don't see that happening from a policy perspective. And I think if we start looking at the results of 2021 and the economic or lack of economic growth and support for small businesses, the enabling environment and policy environment has not been there.
You've also lamented what you describe as a box-ticking exercise in trying to do this in the current government approach. What exactly do you mean by that? And can we, in fact, reverse it at this point?
I think if we start looking at some of the legislation that is in place to support small businesses, one of the main drivers is through our broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act. And specifically around enterprise and supplier development. But if we start looking at the legislation, what it incentivizes corporate South Africa to do is actually just focus on the inputs. So the Act looks at a percentage of organizations' net profit after tax as a contribution. They don't. The Act does not look at how that money gets spent. And what happens, I think, out in corporate South Africa is that it can so easily become a tick box exercise to get the BEE points, but no one is really focused on the real impact that it's making on small businesses. Are we supporting small businesses to grow their businesses? Are we measuring that growth? Are we measuring the opportunities for small businesses to create jobs that's so much needed in South Africa? And I think that compliance behavior is one of the biggest challenges that faces the South African economy in order to focus on the growth that's needed.
I want to stay for a moment longer with the issue of funding, because how does government better fund and assist SMEs given the current challenges? Because what I'm getting from you is that it takes more than just pouring in more billions into SME funding, but the structure itself perhaps needs a relook. Am I right?
That's correct, Thembekile. I think that if we start looking at some of the government mechanisms out there that supports funding of small businesses, it comes at quite a hefty cost. So if you look at, for instance, the Small Enterprise Finance Agency, SEFA, the rates at which they're lending is very much competitive to that of your corporate lenders, your banking institutions. And once again, government needs to be able to be an enabler and therefore be able to provide funding at more reasonable rates. I think one of the other elements that we saw specifically on the impact of COVID and all the COVID funds that came up was that a lot of small businesses were not able to necessarily meet the rigorous requirements set in place in order to get funding. And hence, their ability to access that funding in order to grow their businesses is not taking place. And I think, once again, government needs to be able to look at their due diligence processes in order to create more of an enabling opportunity for funding to come through to small businesses and not try and compete necessarily with your corporate banks or financiers.
So in the short term, in the immediate term, Shawn, do you think the focus for SMEs currently in the country should be on assisting the existing ones to grow or creating more?
I think it's definitely both in a sense, Thembekile. So one of the biggest drivers, if we start looking at the statistics out there, is that small businesses are definitely the ones that will be growing, the job opportunities out there. So if we compare, for instance, I just looked at some of the statistics in 2013 from Stats SA. You had small businesses at that point in time contributing, I think, around about 18%. Whereas now in 2019, the contribution of small businesses increased to 22% of GDP growth, whereas your big businesses have actually declined during that period. So even though the National Development Plan focuses on small businesses being the job creators, we need to be able to provide the necessary support mechanisms in order to ensure that they are able to grow, able to access opportunity, and also have the necessary policy environment in place in order to make doing business easier for them.
As a parting shot, just on the creation of conducive environments for growth and people even beginning to establish or start SMEs, do the incubation hubs and the other sort of digital tools which have been introduced in the last decade or so especially, have they been greatly effective?
I think, Thembekile, what we need to be able to do there is focus on accountability and impact. I think that government has put a lot of investment into incubation hubs. In the property industry, for instance, I founded and manage a property incubator called Property Point, where we focus on supporting small and growing businesses. The challenge is that the impact of these incubation hubs need to be measured. It's not good enough to say we have a vision from government, for instance, to establish 240 incubation hubs, but we don't measure the effectiveness of what they are doing and how they are assisting small businesses. So I think key elements for me in terms of that growth is we need to understand how many jobs are being grown by small businesses. We need to also look at the actual revenue growth rate of these small businesses and their own survival within industries. And also key focus areas in terms of where industries are growing and being able to support businesses in terms of that. Government also has a strong focus on localization, but we need to make sure that we are creating that support infrastructure in order to assist small businesses to grow and produce locally. I think we've also heard last year, and I think for me 2022 is really going to be focused on seeing how government is going to open up these doors. The president has spoken numerous times around the infrastructure fund. We want to see how small businesses are going to be able to be part of those type of initiatives and being able to measure the effectiveness of it.
Shawn, thank you very much for speaking to us tonight. That was Growth Point Properties Executive for Corporate Social Responsibility, Shawn Theunissen, speaking to us about the year ahead for small and medium enterprises in this country. Well,